This is the most well-known Confederate, presented by Kofi Reeves-Miller, Cameron Travis, Chris Yoder, and Rick Miroshkin. The Civil War is one of the most important events in the history of the United States of America. It was a critical period in the development of our nation, and as complicated and complex as one of its iconic figures, Robert Edward Lee. Viewed as a hero by some and a villain by others, Lee was a man of honorable and dishonorable qualities and actions. According to Alan Guelzo's article, Robert E. Lee in Slavery, he was born into two prominent families. His mother's side was one of the largest slave-owning families in Virginia, while his father served as a cavalry officer in the American Revolution, was the governor of Virginia from 1791 to 1794, and an appointed member of the House of Representatives. But while he came from pedigree, he wasn't exactly well off. His father, though regarded as a hero in the Revolutionary War and given the nickname Light Horse Henry, was not the best businessman. When Robert was only 2, his father went to debtor's prison. A couple years after that, he went to the West Indies and apparently did not see it fit that he return. This left Lee's mother widowed with 7 children. According to Clifford Doughty's article, Lee was the closest to their mother, and it was his admiration of her morals and contrast of his father's substandard way of life to the more opulent lifestyle of his relatives that instilled him with the drive to succeed. Ranking second in his class, Lee graduated from West Point Military Academy without a single demerit. After graduating, he married Mary Custis Washington, a descendant of George Washington. Like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and countless other American history figures, Lee owned slaves. Growing up in Virginia, Lee was surrounded by slavery, as it was the norm back then. Lee's views on slavery were ambiguous at best, but sometimes he showed indifference toward African American struggles, while at other times, such as after the Civil War, he accepted them being granted rights and being treated as equals. He ended up inheriting all his slaves, first from his mother and later on being passed the estate of his father-in-law. The will left for him dictated that all slaves be freed within 5 years. Yet Lee actively petitioned to have these slaves under his control for longer. He would not hesitate to get violent if they misbehaved, and according to The Myth of the Kindly General Lee, one slave called him one meanest man she had ever met. However, Lee did admit he viewed slavery as a moral and political evil. In his military career, he distinguished himself in various battles during the U.S.-Mexico War. When the Civil War came, Lee was faced with the hardest decision of his life. He needed to decide what side to fight for. A loyal Virginian as well as a loyal American, Lee was opposed to secession and war, but his beloved Virginia had seceded and joined the Confederacy. He was offered a commanding position in the Union by General Winfield Scott, but Lee ultimately decided that he was a Virginian first, so he resigned from the U.S. Army and joined Virginia and the rest of the Confederate States. Lee joined Virginia and the Confederacy as he saw the war as not a bout over slavery, but higher constitutional ideals. After doing this, he gained the stigma of being a traitor. In the war, he won countless battles, namely against Union General George McClellan. The Union had major advantages over the Confederacy, and was thought to be able to win the war in less than a year, but thanks to the genius of Lee, the Confederacy managed to make the war last 4 years. When the time came for the Confederacy to surrender at Appomattox, Lee acted with very high honor. The Confederate Army did not want to surrender and had plans to keep fighting using guerrilla warfare, but General Lee was able to persuade not to do so and to join him in his gracious surrender. After the war, he was revered by people in the South as well as in the North. Lee declined Confederate monuments in his honor because he'd rather move on from the calamity, but many were still built for him. According to historian Russell Contreras, while the South tried to recover from the war after his death, they appointed none other than Lee as the figurehead of their reconstruction. The U.S. Mint would go on to issue a coin in his honor, and Lee has been on 5 postage stamps. Most Union figures weren't even granted as many honors. According to the article Lee After the War, President Lincoln pardoned Lee and Lee applied to become a U.S. citizen once more, which was posthumously granted to him in 1975. Unable to return to his estate in Arlington, Virginia, as the federal government turned it into a war cemetery, Lee and his family moved to Lexington, Virginia. In Lexington, Lee became the president of Washington College and held the position until his death in 1870. Shortly after, Washington College was renamed to Washington and Lee College, and Lee's son George Washington Custis Lee followed in his father's footsteps and became the president of the college. In America today, there are conflicted feelings about Robert E. Lee. Once a renowned national hero, today many say that he is no American hero, but an American villain who is a racist, slave owner, and traitor to the country. They view him as a symbol of racism and slave times and call for the removal of his statues. Others, such as President Trump and past presidents like Dwight D. Eisenhower, still believe that Lee is a hero and talk about his honorable deeds and try to explain his dishonorable ones.
Well, I do think there's blame. Yes, I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either. And if you reported it accurately, you would say.
Charlottesville. They showed up in Charlottesville
Excuse me.
to protest.
Excuse me. They didn't put themselves down as you, and you had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group, excuse me, I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name.
Robert E. Lee are not the same.
No, George Washington was a slave owner. Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, excuse me, are we going to take down statues to George Washington? How about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? You like him? Okay, good. Are we going to take down the statue? Because he was a major slave owner. Now we're going to take down his statue. So you know what? It's fine. You're changing history, you're changing culture, and you had people, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists, okay? And the press has treated them absolutely unfairly. Now, in the other group also, you had some fine people, but you also had troublemakers, and you see them come with the black outfits, and with the helmets, and with the baseball bats. You had a lot of bad people in the other group too. So I only tell you this: there are two sides to a story. I thought what took place was a horrible moment for our country, a horrible moment. But there are two sides to the country. Does anybody have a final?
In conclusion, one side of Lee represents the roots of America, and for another, everything that they detest. Both viewpoints are valid, they just come from a different side of the pond. But at the end of the day, Lee is a crucial part of America's past, and as we struggle to deal with his influence in the present, his complex existence will surely play a hand in shaping our future.